That's there to remind me to get it recording. And don't forget, there's lunch afterwards. And if you're on campus, there's lots of fantastic opportunities to meet up with each other. So I will stop sharing now and I will hand over to Danica.
Okay. What's this? Yeah, there we go. Bit of a title page, but you're all here because you want to see this talk, so I'll just move on to the next one. Traditionally, educators evaluate the effectiveness of a new regime using student satisfaction surveys, grades, and pass rates. However, the impact of any change does not actually become apparent until a couple of years later, until the new cohort of students can be compared with a prior cohort. If we are doing a better measure, it would be looking at the impact of the new assessment regime on a chain of subjects, especially when a particular subject is a prerequisite. So Maths Modelling 1, I've coordinated that from 2016 to 2020, is a prerequisite for Maths Modelling 2 and Fundamentals of Mechanical Engineering, as well as a whole host of other engineering subjects. So we're going to look at the impact of assessment on Maths Modelling 1 on these two subjects. Now, from 2008 to 2016, there have been 4 different types of assessments used in it. S1 is in fact autumn, S2 is referring to spring, S3 is referring to summer. Originally, it started with class tests, assignment, routine review sheets, which are little sheets that students did every week to review the material before they came into the tute. And there was a compulsory final exam. Later on, the assignment was removed and we had 2 class tests. And then in 2014, we moved to a blended learning approach with online mastery, with an optional final exam. So you could actually get a pass by obtaining 80% in each of the 4 mastery tests, which were given 3 times online. And then it was an option to get better grades to sit the final exam. Now, as you can see with the assessments in the first case, second case, and third case, we have a high failure rate. If you consider 20% high, I don't think it's particularly high, but actually I think the grade distribution is quite nice. But by introducing the online mastery, there was a massive drop in fails. This looks absolutely fabulous, absolutely fabulous. However, a couple of years into this, I turned up in 2016. We're having talks with FATE coordinators, and they indicated a large proportion of students were getting through without the expected knowledge from Maths Modelling 1. I also had alarm bells ringing because we had 98% pass rate in autumn, where students were getting full marks, 62.5 in the mastery, but they were struggling to obtain 7% in the final exam. All I needed was 7% in that final exam to move up to a credit grade. And they would email, I would check the final exam, they would write heaps, but it was clear that there was a lack of understanding of some of these students in the maths, which means the online mastery was not doing the job it was supposed to be doing, which is a pity because it was a really elegant system. The other thing is we had the student president of the Electrical Engineering Society asked for a meeting, Alex Hiller, to discuss the poor mathematical knowledge of students coming from M1. And when a student says something, we have to listen. We also analysed the data. So this is 64, but the reality is the top mark you can receive in mastery is 62.5. So we looked at the MM1 data from autumn and the MM2 data in spring, because these students go into spring. And we found we had students, more than 50% of students are getting 62.5 or top marks in mastery. But if we look at the exam, the median score is in fact 40%. It doesn't transfer very well. This is published. We also found that students, 89% of the students who did well in mastery were doing the final exam, but only 72% chose to sit the final exam in M2 or Mathematics 2. This indicates that they've learnt to pass the subject, but they're not learning to wanting to exceed or improve. So we thought maybe we need to bring in the final exam, bring it back, make it compulsory so that they've got a major goal at the end. In Maths Modelling 1, this is called Iteration 4 is with online mastery, and this is online mastery plus a compulsory final exam. And you can see the failure rate went up. In fact, we ran a supplementary. This is in autumn 2017. The original pass rate was 55%. Only in running the supplementary did the pass rate go up. So clearly, online mastery really was not enabling learning. So 125 students sat that supplementary, and I asked them after they finished the test to sit back, hold back and actually talk. So we had 100 students afterwards talk, and I asked them, I mean, why not? They're the ones give the best feedback. Why? What happened? And they felt there was a massive disconnect with the online mastery difficulty and what was expected in the final exam. So to bring alignment, we moved away from the online mastery and instead went to paper threshold tests. The other thing is, because it was called mastery, the students were thinking, well, we got 80%, therefore we must be doing fantastic, because the threshold in the mastery test was 80%. So instead, we moved to paper threshold tests. We called them threshold tests to move away from the mastery term. As with the mastery test, there was 4 tests, but we had 3. We also had 3 chances. The first test is assumed knowledge, which is they were still required to get 80% on this one. The next 3 were on 2 to 3 weeks of content. In fact, the first test was 2 weeks, the next one was 3 weeks, and the one after that was 3 weeks. So they cover in these threshold tests about 8 weeks of material out of 11. Not even 8, about 7.5. And in those next 3 tests, they needed a threshold of 70%. The difference is these tests were actually broken up as half fundamental content and half on application outside of mathematics. And the students were exposed to these applications in class. This was to break down the barriers so that they can realise that they can use this in other settings. Okay, where a question was worth more than 1 mark, students were expected to show their thought process by including full solutions. The other thing is the threshold tests, unlike the online mastery, the feedback was correct or incorrect. With regards to the threshold test, because they were taken in class on paper, we scheduled after the first sitting, there was always feedback session in the tutorials. That feedback session run by the tutors, they go through the solutions, the students can actually ask what, where and how they went wrong. Okay, and it was done so the students couldn't just take the test and put it in their bag, because we've said to the students, we reuse these tests, we're not returning them permanently. You have to give them back. So that meant in that hour of the tute session, they had to spend time learning where they went wrong, okay, how they went right. Their chance to ask the tutor, oh, look, maybe you marked this incorrectly, or why was this marked incorrectly, okay? It was about making sure that they had something to build on. Now, in Maths Modelling 1, looking at the grade, you think, oh, well, this is in fact including threshold tests. Yes, we've still got a high failure rate in autumn. there's not really much of a shift. However, this one here, we already know was not being particularly helpful. So instead of looking within the subject, we decided to look at how students went when they went from MM1 or Maths 1 to Maths 2. And Maths 2 also had mastery tests. The thing is, we introduced a compulsory final exam. We both in MM1 and MM2, and you can see there's a slight shift to higher grades. However, when we introduced the threshold test in MM1, in MM2, you can see that there is a grade inversion with high distinctions and distinctions, making up 60% of the grade. What this means is that because there is now a compulsory final exam in MM2, students were getting 50% or more in that final exam. These ones here are getting 70% or more. These ones here are getting at least 50% in that final exam. So in MM1, through these threshold tests, they have not only learnt from feedback, they've learnt to actually optimize their study processes. They've learnt some self-efficacy, they've got confidence and resilience. But the thing is, you're thinking to yourself, but wait a sec, this is just a math subject. If we look at the fundamentals of mechanical engineering, we say the same thing, except when we introduced the exam in MM1, it worked as a gate, and the failure rate in fundamentals of mechanical engineering went down, and there's a slight shift to higher grades. And once we put the threshold tests in, once again, we have that grade inversion. This means our students are not only learning how to learn mathematics and applying this in Maths 2, they are also doing this in their discipline subject. Okay, which is pretty much saying here it's transferable skills, they're developing confidence and resilience, and a strong foundation in the subject under study. Okay, so the combination of feedback, the threshold tests, means that they're taking an experimental approach, learning deeper, adopting deeper learning processes. There are drawbacks to this. Okay, the required threshold gives the false impression that the students need to know 100% of the subject. In fact, it's only 60% of the material they have to actually learn. Okay, owed to the multiple chances, the threshold tests require more than 18 hours given for the assessment. So there needs to be support for coordinators who run these sorts of assessment in their subjects to give them more time to develop these tests. Students who don't succeed after 3 chances send multiple emails requesting for another chance. And it is beneficial for students who don't have holes in the knowledge, but there are students who have holes in their knowledge and they need other resources. So when you have the feedback, they need the other resources so they can catch up. So conclusion, the outcomes of threshold tests are brilliant. They prepare students well for follow-on subjects, owed to the multiple chances. It gives students a chance to learn how to learn and refine their study technique with feedback and move to learning techniques, and they'll end up defaulting to these deep learning techniques and follow-on subjects because they found these techniques to be successful. Okay, have I gone over time, Richard?
A little bit, Danica, but we're all good. Thank you so much. That was fascinating stuff. We'll move straight into the next presentation and we'll have questions for everyone at the end. So we're moving on to Isa and Devashri from UPass. Cool. You guys okay to share your screen, I think?
Yeah.
There we go. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Can you see our screen?
All good. All good.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name's Isa and this is my partner, Devashri. So we're going to be talking about the implications of destructive and constructive feedback. So our firstly, we're going to be talking about destructive feedback, and destructive feedback is generally defined as not helpful or constructive, and feedback that feels like a formal obligation from the teacher to the student, and feedback that hinders our progress, and feedback that doesn't allow us to grow or learn.
So here we have an example we found on UTS Confessions. This is an anonymous from a student, and they're just talking about their experiences with destructive feedback and how the comments made by their tutor was degrading and discouraging. It didn't exactly help them with anything. It wasn't constructive at all.
And it feels, if a student receives this type of feedback, they feel unmotivated, especially because it's about their career field, and it's something that they've already kind of gotten themselves into. So when they receive this type of feedback, especially in an online setting where they're individual, it's not that great. So an example of destructive feedback is generic comments. And so we think generic comments are comments that are given to everyone. They're very surface level, so they're not specific or personalized, and there's no feedback on how to do well, especially if there are future assessments that we could use that feedback to improve upon.
Yeah, these kind of feedback, it's kind of like a one size fits all. It doesn't exactly indicate to a student what their strengths and weaknesses are. And that's kind of like the main thing with students. They themselves might not know what their personal strengths and weaknesses are, but with feedback that can help them identify what they are. And then why are generic comments destructive? Well, like I said, they don't exactly allow us to improve ourselves because we have no insight or indication how we can improve ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a personal example that I had from generic comments where I had a university presentation, but I had no feedback on the pacing, timing, or how to improve my presentation. Instead, it was just more of a very general, you just did well. And I'm unable to use that type of feedback for future presentations or assessments that I had.
So another type of destructive feedback is no feedback at all. So what is that? Well, it's basically just only a mark is given and no comments or feedback are given. And this, again, doesn't provide us any indication of what we did right and wrong. So I had a personal example of this where for one of my introductory core units, I had an assignment worth 40% and I didn't receive any comments or feedback at all. And the implications for that was that for that same subject, I had another assignment which was also worth 40%, and I didn't know what to take from that first one to the second one. So I didn't know, like, what had I lost marks on, what did I do right and wrong, what can I improve on?
And so the next type of feedback we'll be talking about is constructive feedback. So what is constructive feedback? It is feedback that points at improvement. So it's personalized comments and specific comments on how to improve. They're helpful for the individual with future assessments. And also in the workplace, and they're similar to constructive criticism, and it improves on someone's creation, reputation, or self-esteem. And feedback can be used for students to get a more holistic understanding of the subject.
So one type of constructive feedback is helpful feedback. So this is feedback that indicates students their strengths and weaknesses. It helps a student improve on specific areas, and it can also help the student feel more confident about their work and boost their self-esteem. So it's specific examples as to how we can improve, not just you did well, what did I do to do well? So things like that.
And so these are some of our examples of helpful feedback. In particular, this one was a subject from my finance major, and it was very specific to the parts in, because it was a group essay, and so it was very specific to in the essay the things that I had to improve upon. And this was another example given by, I think it was one of my IT subjects, and it was a lab. So it wasn't worth much, but I still received a lot of feedback about it because it was actually a question that I was struggling with. So it was helpful for me to get this type of feedback because it helped me understand the subject a lot better.
Yeah, and then on the right is something I received, which was very helpful. And this is just the overall comments. So there were specific comments within the actual essay. This is half of the overall comments. And I've just blurred out a bit there just to not indicate what subject it is. But this was really helpful to me because she told me that I could use subheadings and implement these in my further essays just so that it would be more easier to navigate throughout the essay. And then she also referred me to specific journals that I could use for examples in further essays. And this was just helpful to me because now I knew like what I could take from this assignment and use it for further assignments.
Mm-hmm. And so our last type of constructive feedback is advice and implementing feedback. So advice and implementing feedback is a cycle of growth and development. So we're able to use the feedback in future assessments, but also in workplaces. So an example that I have as a UPass leader is particularly in one of my UPass sessions, I had a very tricky student. And so I ended up reaching out for support from my manager, and she helped me in ways to deal with the situation. And also I was able to reflect on my initial reaction to the tricky student, and how I used her feedback in practice was I usually have a notebook that I use for UPass where I write down my preparation and my planning. And so I wrote down like scenarios if I had to come across it, how I would deal with it, and that personally helped me.
Yeah, and then also advice and implementing feedback, it's a form of support. So when markers or teachers, they provide helpful feedback, it forms a connection between the student and the teacher. And feedback, as my partner said, it's a cycle of growth and development. So it doesn't just have to be for assignments, it can be for life things in general. So once that connection is formed, the student can then ask the teacher things about life or like the workplace or any sort of feedback for any sort of experience. And again, with both of us as a U+ leader, we had this form of support, form of feedback where we got personalized feedback where a senior leader would come to one of our sessions and they would go through us with the session. They would talk us through what we did right, what we did wrong. And it was very helpful for us because it felt like a conversation. It was like dialogue. It wasn't just like on paper feedback.
Mm-hmm. And so that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. They're really fascinating insights. I'm sure there's going to be some questions at the end of the session, but we will keep moving on. Over to my colleague Mace. And just before Mace begins, I'll just remind you, we do have that Teams space. So if you would like to drop a comment or a question in the Teams channel, please do so. Over to you, Mace.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the first speakers, and I'll be borrowing some of the limitations that you've used today about talking about the design of the assessment in mathematics, and the comment that the lovely students shared with us that they actually want a feedback that helps them grow. So my topic today is use of feedback to enhance the quality of student-generated open educational resources. And what I would like to talk to you about today are like a few things. I'll talk about what is the thing that I'm thinking of and the problem that I find. I'll talk about what is student-generated open education resources, and I'll share with you a model that can be implemented into learning and teaching. And I'll show you the feedback points into that model that can enhance the outcomes of students' production. I'll share the evaluation criteria and some benefits of what I'm talking about. So I hope that's going to be beneficial for today, mainly because Naomi, our keynote speaker today in the morning, she started talking about key challenges in feedback. So as academics, spend a huge number of hours giving feedback, and with a hope that students will understand, implement, and that feedback will have impact on their learning. What I'll talk about today is in line with what Naomi addressed in the morning, and also the problem is that majority of the feedback sometimes is not well utilized. Therefore, it's not visible to keep doing things the same way. So how to maximize learning through this without actually increasing the workload in academics. So this is actually, and I'll start to put some concepts first for you. So every semester, students spend large amount of time and efforts writing essays, developing projects, generating video assessments, etc. And markers, academics, spend another considerable amount of time marking, giving feedback. However, what students produce and what the marker evaluates and give feedback on remains within this closed cycle. So it's one-to-one relationship. So imagine this collective number of hours that students and academics spend, and I really like to call it the cognitive surplus inside the classroom. So imagine that all of that has been tapped into something with more value. So converting that personal value of feedback to more of a communal value. So where students will still be doing their assignments for the same or maybe improved set of learning outcomes, and academics will still provide feedback, but the final outcome is actually shared as resources that can benefit others or open educational resources. So these cycles happen almost in every subject. Now, I would like you to think about the number of hours that you spend giving feedback per semester. So if we do like a simple calculations, and we've got a lot of mathematicians here in the room, will do that better than I will, but I'll try to figure this out. So if you have a subject with the 3 assignments and you've got like 100 students, and if a student spend like a third of the study time on assignments, that's equal to 150 hours per semester for the 3 assignments, of course, presuming a full-time students would need 30 hours per week on private study. So if you have the 100 students, that means collectively we'll spend 15,000 hours per semester on assignments, building content, generating assignments. And you will be spending approximately 150 hours to mark 3 assignments for those 100 students. So simple math. Those assignments that's sitting and feedback that has been given sitting on these shelves, as you can see, and a huge number of hours that is spent there. So this is where I'm coming from, tapping into that cognitive surplus that happens inside the classrooms. So some of the terminologies that we use in this domain has been investigated by research, so this is not new. The use of digital tools in educational environment and the ways to utilize these tools in learning and teaching is also, it's not new. So the term, for example, student-generated content is coming from user-generated content that emerged with the introduction of Web 2.0 tools. So we had terms like renewable assessments, student-generated videos, student-generated OER, and student-generated modules or do-it-yourself module, do-it-your-own, module. So again, back to Naomi's keynote. So she also mentioned that to enhance feedback process, we need to focus on 3 things. And I'd like to add a fourth point. So she talked about the design. So similar to Denitya was talking about the design of implementing feedback through several points through the semester. We always think about feedback being only attached to assessment, what students learn. We don't design for students' ability to produce content that can be useful for others. So that's another design consideration that probably is important to listen to, and repurpose that time to spend of the feedback that we give to students to model something with an impact. And the second thing she mentioned is the skills. And if we develop like some of the skills to maximize students' responsibilities with building assignments and build that feedback in a way that help them and encourage them to utilize that. And she also talked about relationships. What I would like to also to add is value, converting the feedback from having personal value to communal value. So to do that, what I've done, I'm sharing some of my work here, is that we looked into what students generate in a subject in data mining, and we asked them to build open educational resources. We scaffolded the learning process, and we helped providing feedback, a constructive feedback and early feedback actually during the semester, so students would have the opportunity to improve their work. So what I'm showing you now is the outcome, and then I'll go to the model. So these are some of the students' resources that they have developed. The previous work from, sorry, this is not supposed to say not available, but it is. So apology about that. I'll send it with the slides. The student-generated videos by Kearney provide a very nice design model for utilizing learner-generated digital stories for pre-service teachers. And I've got a beautiful colleague also from the University of Southern Queensland who's actually used the same model to engage students in generating open textbooks. So open, free, student, anyone can use and reuse, learning the licenses that are available. Another outcome is where Wiley collaborated with the students to produce another open textbook. Now, again, we know there are a lot of digital tools that can be utilized for student-generated content. But what I want to stop for here is this model. It shows how the content can be developed with the students at several stages. Students engage with developing open educational resources. They receive feedback from their academics and eventually publish their work as OER. Feedback is received at an earlier cycle by peers, by academics, and students are invited to refine their work early in the semester. The model has been adopted and expanded to receive feedback from professionals. So students will have also input to their work, and the open textbooks that I've showed you earlier from the University of Southern Queensland actually used feedback by professionals to produce the open textbooks. Now, what was missing of the evaluation criteria for educational resources or digital educational resources is the focus on, most of them they focus on technology and instructional design of it, but very few actually, and maybe none, focus on the openness and the liveness and currency and the role of the community of these resources. So the criteria that I'm showing you here that addresses the technical, openness, and educational aspects for the students in that mindset where I'm not only producing because of awaiting a response and feedback from my academics, but also designing and building content because this is going to have a broader audience, hence the openness criteria. I'm going to end with the benefits of tapping into feedback of student-generated content. And I'll say sustainability for open educational resources is a big thing, and quality is often a barrier. So if we utilize that feedback mechanisms that happen inside the classroom, we can improve the quality of open educational resources. Utilize feedback techniques that takes place during the semester, not towards the end, and integrate through the curriculum design or the subject design, and finally engage students in authentic learning experiences. So I just dropped this question towards the end. What are the benefits or maybe challenges that you would see in this model? And that concludes my presentation for today.
Thank you so much, Mace, and thanks so much to all of the presenters for this session. Again, Danica, who was talking about improving student achievement in mathematics assessments. We had Isa and Devashri talking about destructive and constructive feedback, and Mace there on student-generated open educational resources. We do have 10 minutes. There's no actual questions in our Teams channel, but I would invite you to unmute yourself if you have a question for one of our presenters or any comments. So please, the floor is open. Aurora.
Oh, you saw my mic was off. Beautiful.
Ding.
Yeah, ding. Thanks to all the presenters. You know, always just got, you know, head exploding, so much to think about. And of course, the opportunity to speak to students is always one that I'll take up. So my question is for Devi and Isa. You were talking, it really strikes me like you're, in requiring your lecturers to give you very specific feedback, it means that I need to really know exactly what I'm looking for with students' work. And sometimes I just want to say to them, go deeper, go deeper. Do you think that we need to do some more work with students around like feedback literacy, like how to actually, so that it is more of a dialogue and understanding? Do you think we should devote more class time to that kind of stuff?
Definitely. I feel like if you allow class time for us to do it, it would be better, so we can have like a dialogue, because also some people don't really know how to reach out to subject coordinators or like lecturers or even tutors, because some of them do say not to email them sometimes. So
Yeah, and then that way students are like definitely going to be in that feedback and get that conversation and that dialogue flowing.
Yeah, okay, allowing class time for this. There's so much to fit into classes all the time, isn't there?
that's true. Especially online, you always go overtime as well.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that, guys. I can see Roger's got his hand up.
Thank you, Richard. There's a question for Danica, which is about the shift in the kind of the threshold tests, I suppose, from quizzes to thresholds. And I'm particularly interested in this because we're pivoting the mechanical engineering curriculum to be rather oriented in this direction. And I can see that we need to talk to in more detail about what succeeded in MM1. And I'm wondering if you'd just talk a little bit more about how the questions or the kinds of questions have shifted in that process. And that might be very helpful to us.
Okay. As I said, the threshold tests are designed so it's half fundamental stuff, so that you're actually testing, can they do what's within the subject? And then the other half is application. And the reason why we did the application with MM1 is because we were getting feedback that they couldn't apply in subjects other than the maths. So we needed to make sure that we broke the barrier. It's no longer just X, Y, Z, but they could actually use it for anything. So the other thing is, by requiring the full solution, it meant that we had access to their thought process on how to solve the problem. And if you don't put that in, they don't think it through themselves. I mean, by accessing thought processes, they have to think it through themselves. So, but Roger, we can definitely get together and actually talk. It's been a while since I've seen you. So
yeah, that'll be good. I think we need to talk in some detail about this.
Yeah.
Yep. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I can see another hand up. Janabai, yeah, please.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yep. My question is actually to Maze Patel, and she talked about student-generated learning resources. So I'm wondering whether that student-generated learning, when students create those learning resources, are those part of another assessment, or they just generate spontaneously or enthusiastically? That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, they are part of assessment. So in the examples that I showed you from Western Sydney, they're actually part of two subjects in School of Computing, and students were required to develop those as part of the assessment. So because that was a new idea like for them. So what we did, we done some workshops for students to upskill them. And for the other example that I showed you from University of Southern Queensland, it was an assessment, so I can send you the link to the assessment description as well, which is actually in the open textbook, saying that students are required to generate articles, and each article was developed by one student, and then they all put together after the revision of the subject coordinator. So they definitely and put together as open textbook. So yeah, all of them were part of assessments.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Mace. And I can see there's a question from Scott.
Hi, I just had a question for Asa and Devashri. Apologies for pronouncing your names wrong. So I think I really enjoyed your presentation, and I really love to hear the student perspective on feedback and what you as students view as the most valuable forms of feedback. A question I have though is, we as academics do like to spend a bit of time on rubrics and making sure that there is set criteria for each different side of things, like, you know, whether it's the writing, whether it's the content, and then within the rubric, there's certain sort of thresholds, to steal Danica's term, that we would expect each student to be meeting for that particular criteria. And sometimes we as academics believe that by giving you a particular grade that matches up to that particular rubric, that is a form of feedback, in the sense that we are saying that from what we've read, for this particular criteria, you have demonstrated these specific things. In your experience as students, have you been provided with those sorts of rubrics? Hopefully you have. And then do you then go and have a look at those particular specific criteria and reflect? I just want to know what's the best way that we can give you feedback, whether you more value that personalized comment, or whether it's that that we can have a conversation with you around reflecting on the rubric criteria feedback.
For me personally, there's one time where I received a rubric feedback, but the mark for it was like, I received all of them above average, but my mark was 9.75 out of 10. And I didn't know where the 0.25 went, even though it was in from the matrix, all of them was above average. So I didn't know where that mark went. So if there was an option for a dialogue, that would be better, because I'd be able to find out where that mark went.
Yeah, and then some of the rubrics, like, they vary depending on the subject. So some of them, I do agree, they do point to the requirements of what the student can do better, but then some of them are very broad and they aren't exactly helpful. So I would say, if it is like in the broad sense, maybe like additional comments could be helpful, but the ones that are very specific in terms of you met this requirement, you didn't meet this one, those, I guess, yeah, they are helpful.
Okay, great, thank you.
That's it.
And I think we're just on to lunchtime, guys. That's probably the end of our question session, but thank you so much again to all of our presenters and to everyone that asked a question. Please remember that we do still have that Teams channel running, so you can still be in contact with each other. Drop some questions in there if you would like to. Thank you so much for joining us for this session, and we'll see you this afternoon for more of the forum. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you.